Picture this. 800 years before Christ, somewhere in what we now call Norway. The darkness isn't just dark, it's the kind of crushing, absolute blackness that swallows sound itself. And the cold? We're talking 40 degrees below zero. Not the kind of cold where you complain about your heating bill, the kind of cold that kills you. Inside a crude shelter made of stacked stones and whatever timber they could scavenge, a family of 7 huddles together. The father, let's call him Ulf, stares at their fire, not enjoying it, not warming himself by it, calculating. Because that fire, that tiny, flickering miracle keeping death at bay is down to 3 logs. 3 logs, between 7 human beings and the kind of frozen death that would claim them before dawn. Now, you might think, well, they'll just go get more wood. But here's what you need to understand about Scandinavia 800 years before Christ. This isn't a camping trip gone wrong. This is Tuesday. This is life. The nearest trees might be days away through snow that could swallow a grown man whole. And even if they could reach those trees, even if they could cut them down with their primitive tools, how do you haul enough firewood back to last through a winter that stretches for months? You don't. You die. Most people died. But some didn't. And the difference between the ones who lived and the ones who became frozen corpses scattered across the Nordic landscape, they learned something that would change everything. They learned that fire isn't just about making flame, it's about trapping its soul. Think about the physics for a moment. Fire produces heat, yes, but where does that heat go? In Ulf's shelter, most of it goes straight up and out into that merciless sky. He's not heating his family. He's heating Norway. Every precious calorie from those 3 remaining logs is escaping into the infinite cold above their heads. Now, imagine you're Ulf's wife, Ingrid. You've watched 2 of your children die in previous winters. Not from starvation, they had some food. Not from disease, they were healthy. From cold, pure, simple, mathematical cold. Your body produces only so much heat. The environment steals that heat faster than you can make it. The equation doesn't balance, and you die. But maybe, just maybe, you've noticed something. Maybe you've seen how your breath creates a small warm cloud. Maybe you've noticed that when you sleep close together, everyone stays warmer. Maybe you've observed that when you pile stones around the fire, those stones stay warm even after the flames die down. We know about insulation and heat retention. But to these people, figuring this out was like discovering fire itself all over again. It was the difference between civilization and extinction. Generation after generation, families like Ulf's conducted deadly experiments. They tried different ways of arranging stones. They experimented with how to bank a fire so it would burn longer. They discovered that certain types of earth could hold heat for hours. Each winter was a laboratory, and failure meant death. But success? Success meant your children lived to have children of their own. Slowly, and I mean over centuries, patterns emerged. The survivors shared certain innovations. They built their fires in shallow pits lined with flat stones. They learned to heat those stones during the day and let them radiate warmth through the night. They discovered that animal hides could trap warm air if arranged properly. Most importantly, they began to understand something that would revolutionize northern life. The breath of animals could heat human spaces. Picture this breakthrough. Some forgotten genius, maybe it was a woman whose name history never recorded, noticed that when their few precious livestock huddled together in one corner of the shelter, that corner stayed noticeably warmer. Not just from their body heat, but from their breathing. Each cow, each goat, each sheep was a living furnace, constantly producing warm, moist air. What if you could capture that? What if you could design your shelter so that animal breath warmed human spaces? What if the very shape of your building could multiply the heat your fire produced? By 600 before Christ, these innovations had crystallized into something extraordinary. Enter Bjorn the Bold, and yes, that was probably his actual name, because when you've invented a heating system that saves your entire clan, people remember you with respect. Bjorn's revolutionary design featured something that would seem obvious to us, but was revolutionary then. Double walls with an air gap between them. The inner wall radiated heat from the central fire. The outer wall blocked the killing wind. But that gap between them? That gap trapped warm air and created an insulation layer that multiplied their heating efficiency. The winter that made Bjorn famous was the harshest in memory. Other clans burned through their entire wood stores and still froze. Bjorn's people not only survived, they thrived. Children played instead of huddling. Adults worked on crafts instead of fighting hypothermia. While neighboring families rationed every stick of firewood, Bjorn's clan had wood to spare. Word spread. Other clans sent emissaries to study Bjorn's methods. Some tried to steal the techniques. Wars were fought over thermal knowledge. Because by now, these northern peoples understood a fundamental truth. Heating technology wasn't just about comfort, it was about power. The clans with superior heating could support larger populations. They could work through the long winters instead of merely surviving them. They could gather in great numbers for decision-making and celebration. Most crucially, they could raise more children to adulthood, creating the demographic advantage that would eventually fuel Viking expansion across the known world. But perhaps the most fascinating development was the emergence of sacred fire-keeping traditions. Maintaining an eternal hearth became a holy duty, passed from mother to daughter. These weren't just practical skills, they were religious ceremonies. The firekeeper held the life of the community in her hands. Let the sacred flame die, and everyone might follow. These early thermal innovations created something unprecedented in Northern Europe. The possibility of not just surviving winter, but mastering it. The foundations were laid for a revolution that would transform crude survival shelters into architectural marvels that could house hundreds of people while burning less fuel than a modern suburban home. The descendants of families like Ulf's, the ones who figured out how to trap fire's soul, they were about to become something the world had never seen before. They were about to become Vikings, and their secret weapon wasn't just superior ships or fiercer warriors. It was the knowledge of how to stay warm. But that knowledge came at a price that would take centuries to pay, and the innovations they were about to develop would be so revolutionary, so perfectly adapted to their environment, that when they were finally lost, it would take modern science over 1,000 years to rediscover them. By 400 after Christ, something extraordinary had happened in the frozen north. The desperate survival techniques of Ulf and Bjorn's time had evolved into something that would make a modern thermal engineer weep with envy. We're talking about buildings that could house 60 people and 30 head of cattle, while burning half the wood of a Roman villa designed for a single family. Half the wood. Think about that for a moment. Enter Erik Warmkeeper of Trondheim, and yes, that surname tells you everything about how his society valued thermal innovation. Erik wasn't just a builder. He was what we might call today a thermal systems engineer, except he was doing it with hand tools and centuries of accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of survivors. Erik's revolutionary longhouse design in Trondheim was 120 feet long, 40 feet wide, and it housed 3 generations of his extended family, plus their livestock, all in thermal harmony. But here's what makes this so remarkable. Roman engineers of the same period, with all their concrete and hypercaust systems, couldn't achieve anything close to this efficiency. How do we know this? Because we have archaeological evidence of Roman buildings from the same era that burned through massive amounts of fuel and still left people shivering. Meanwhile, Erik's longhouse maintained comfortable temperatures throughout using a heating system so elegant, so perfectly integrated with the building's design, that it seems almost organic. Picture walking into Erik's hall on a winter morning. Outside, it's 20 below zero, and the wind is howling off the North Sea like a banshee. But inside? Inside, children are running around in lightweight tunics. Craftsmen are working with bare hands. Old people are sitting comfortably near the walls instead of fighting each other for spots closest to the fire. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. The longhouse had become what we might call today a living thermal organism. Every element worked together. The thick turf walls didn't just block wind, they breathed with the seasons, expanding when wet to create better insulation, contracting when dry to allow just enough air circulation to prevent condensation and mold. But the real genius was in the integration of human and animal heating systems. Eric had figured out something that would take modern architects centuries to rediscover. Livestock aren't just food sources. They're living furnaces that produce warm, humid air 24 hours a day. The cattle section of Eric's longhouse wasn't separate from the human living space, it was part of a carefully designed thermal circuit. Warm air from the animals' breathing rose naturally and flowed through hidden channels beneath the sleeping platforms where families slept. By morning, those clay platforms would be warm to the touch, heated not by burning precious firewood, but by the natural respiration of cows and goats. The sleeping arrangements alone were a masterpiece of thermal design. Instead of everyone competing for space near the central fire, families slept on raised platforms along the walls, the warmest spots in the entire building because of the heated air flowing beneath them. The most honored guests got the platforms closest to the animal section, not because of the smell, but because those were the warmest beds in the house. Now, you have to understand what this meant in practical terms. In Eric's time, most of Europe was still struggling with basic heating. Saxon halls required 20 or more fires to heat a space half the size of Eric's longhouse. Those fires consumed entire forests and still left people cold. Meanwhile, Eric's people were comfortable with 6 strategically placed fires. 6 fires to heat a space that housed 90 living beings. The fuel efficiency was off the charts. But this wasn't just about staying warm. This was about creating a civilization that could thrive during the months when the rest of Europe basically shut down and waited for spring. While Saxon villages huddled in dark, cold buildings counting days until winter ended, Viking communities were conducting business, making crafts, telling stories, and making plans for the next raiding season. The great building competition of 512 after Christ shows just how seriously these people took their thermal engineering. Picture this. Rival clans gathering from across Scandinavia, each bringing their most innovative longhouse designs. Not for decoration, not for prestige, for survival. The competition was simple, brutal. Each clan would build their design, then live in it through the worst winter in memory. The clan that used the least fuel while keeping their people healthiest would win. More importantly, their design would be copied across the entire region. The winning design came from an unexpected source, young Astrid, keeper of her grandmother's heating secrets. While the men focused on bigger fires and thicker walls, Astrid had been perfecting something entirely different: smoke management and air circulation. Astrid's innovation was underground smoke channels that didn't just carry away dangerous gases. They used the heat from smoke to warm sleeping areas before venting outside. Her longhouse featured a network of stone-lined channels beneath the floor that captured every calorie of heat from the fires before letting the smoke escape. But here's where the story gets dramatic. Astrid's thermal knowledge was so valuable that raiders targeted her family specifically. Not for gold or silver for building techniques. A clan that could build more efficient longhouses could support larger populations, which meant more warriors, which meant military advantage. Imagine being Astrid, barely 20 years old, standing guard over thermal secrets that could shift the balance of power between entire kingdoms. She wasn't just protecting family recipes, she was protecting military technology disguised as domestic architecture. The raid came during the worst blizzard of the season. While Astrid's family slept comfortably in their efficiently heated longhouse, enemy warriors struggled through the storm, driven by desperation to steal thermal knowledge before their own people froze. The irony is perfect, warriors freezing to death while trying to steal the secrets that would keep them warm. Astrid's successful defense of her family's longhouse that night became legendary, but more importantly, her innovations spread across Scandinavia through voluntary adoption rather than theft. Clans sent their best builders to study her methods. Marriage alliances were formed specifically to gain access to thermal technologies. By the end of the 5th century after Christ, the Scandinavian longhouse had become something unprecedented in northern Europe, a building that was perfectly adapted to its environment. Not just surviving winter, but mastering it so completely that winter became the season when Vikings planned their next conquests. The turf walls had evolved to become living insulation that adjusted automatically to weather conditions. The animal heating systems had been refined to precise thermal circuits. The smoke management systems captured and redistributed every possible calorie of heat. Most remarkably, these buildings had developed what we might call thermal democracy. Unlike Roman buildings, where the wealthy stayed warm and the poor froze, longhouse design meant everyone from the jarl to the thralls shared the same comfortable environment. This wasn't charity. This was practical engineering. The thermal systems worked best when everyone's body heat contributed to the overall warmth. This shared thermal environment created unique social bonds. Families, servants, and warriors living in orchestrated harmony, their survival dependent on cooperation rather than competition. Children learned responsibility by helping maintain the heating systems. Adults developed consensus-building skills because everyone had to agree on fuel allocation and fire management. The longhouse wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a social technology that enabled Viking democracy, Viking craftsmanship, and ultimately, Viking expansion. All because they had figured out how to be comfortable when everyone else was miserable. But they were about to perfect something even more remarkable. The golden age of longhouse design was just beginning, and what they would achieve next would seem almost impossible to believe. 793 after Christ. Jarl Thorstein's Great Hall, in what we now call Denmark. Outside, the worst blizzard in decades is trying to kill everything that breathes. Inside, 200 warriors are feasting like it's midsummer, 200 people, in one building, comfortable enough to remove their outer garments, to eat with bare hands, to laugh and argue and plan raids while outside the temperature has dropped to 40 below zero. This magnificent structure stretched 150 feet long, longer than a modern football field, and maintained perfect warmth using only 6 fires. 6. Meanwhile, Saxon halls half that size required 20 fires and still left people huddling under furs. But here's what's truly remarkable. Thorstein's hall wasn't unique. By the late 8th century, halls like this dotted the Scandinavian landscape. The Vikings had perfected thermal engineering to the point where they could create tropical microclimates in the middle of Arctic conditions. Walk through that hall with me for a moment. Your feet touch clay floors that radiate gentle warmth, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that children play barefoot even in December. The walls seem to breathe, expanding and contracting slightly with temperature changes, automatically adjusting their insulation properties. The air itself feels different, warm, slightly humid, perfectly breathable despite housing 200 people and dozens of animals. This wasn't accidental. Every single element had been refined over centuries of experimentation. The placement of those 6 fires wasn't random. They were positioned at precise mathematical points that created optimal air circulation. Warm air rose from each fire, flowed along stone channels built into the roof structure, then descended along the walls to create gentle currents that heated every corner of the massive space. The sleeping arrangements were a marvel of thermal engineering. Raised platforms lined the walls, each one heated by underground channels that carried warm air from the central fires and the animal areas. But these weren't just sleeping spots, they were temperature-controlled environments. The platforms closest to the livestock areas stayed warmest, reserved for honoured guests and the elderly. The platforms near the workshop areas maintained moderate temperatures, perfect for craftsmen who needed to work with their hands. Speaking of workshops, let me paint you a picture that would seem impossible to medieval Europeans. Viking craftsmen working in comfort through polar nights, while Saxon smiths in England could barely work during winter months, their hands too stiff with cold to hold tools properly. Viking metalworkers, wood carvers, and textile workers maintained full productivity year-round. Why? Because Thorstein's hall included dedicated workshop areas with their own thermal zones. Jewellery makers worked near heating channels that kept their hands nimble. Weaponsmiths had forge areas that captured and recirculated heat from their fires. Textile workers sat in spots where warm air from the livestock areas kept them comfortable for hours of detailed work. The social implications were staggering. While the rest of Europe essentially hibernated through winter, Viking communities remained fully active. Children continued their education. Adults planned and prepared for spring campaigns. Craftsmen produced the goods that would be traded or raided for across the known world. But perhaps the most remarkable person in this golden age was Gudrun the Wise, whose innovations in smoke management revolutionized longhouse design even further. Gudrun solved a problem that had plagued all previous builders: how to create even larger gathering spaces without filling them with smoke. Her breakthrough was a revolutionary ventilation system that used principles we wouldn't rediscover until the modern era. Instead of simple holes in the roof, Gudrun created a network of adjustable vents that could be opened or closed depending on wind direction and temperature. More importantly, she developed a smoke circulation system that used the natural draft created by temperature differences to pull smoke away from living areas while capturing its heat. Gudrun's system was so effective that it enabled the construction of gathering halls that could house 500 people comfortably. 500. Imagine the political implications. For the first time in Northern European history, entire communities could gather indoors during winter months. Democratic assemblies, legal proceedings, religious ceremonies, cultural celebrations all could continue regardless of weather. This is where Viking democracy truly flourished. The Thing meetings that would become legendary weren't just possible because of political innovation, they were possible because of thermal innovation. You can't have meaningful democratic discussion when everyone is fighting hypothermia. These massive, heated halls became the heart of Viking civilization. They were schools where skalds taught the oral traditions that preserved Viking history. They were courts where legal disputes were resolved. They were theatres where epic poems were performed. They were planning centres where raids and trade expeditions were organised. Most importantly, they were social melting pots where the rigid class distinctions that defined most medieval societies began to blur. When you're sharing the same perfectly heated air, when your comfort depends on everyone else maintaining the thermal systems properly, when children from all social levels play together in the same warm spaces, traditional hierarchies start to matter less. The Longhouse had created something unprecedented. A genuinely egalitarian environment in the middle of a hierarchical society. Not because Vikings were naturally democratic, but because their heating technology required cooperation to function properly. Daily life in these thermal paradises followed rhythms that would seem luxurious to most medieval Europeans. Children woke up warm, ate breakfast in comfortable common areas, then spent their days learning skills in heated workshops or playing in warm courtyards protected from wind. Adults worked productively regardless of outside temperature, gathering in the evenings for meals that were social events rather than survival exercises. The elderly, instead of being burdens during harsh winters, became valuable keepers of thermal knowledge. Every old woman who remembered her grandmother's heating tricks, every old man who had perfected fire management techniques, became a treasured resource. Age meant wisdom, and wisdom meant survival for everyone. These golden centuries of thermal perfection created the demographic and social conditions that would fuel Viking expansion across the known world. While other northern peoples struggled just to survive winter, Vikings were raising large, healthy families in by king's pins than to turns, comfortable environments. They were developing complex crafts and technologies. They were creating surplus wealth and population that could support military expeditions. The ships that would terrorize Europe were built in heated workshops. The weapons that would conquer territories from Iceland to the Black Sea were forged in temperature-controlled smithies. The warriors who would reshape medieval Europe were raised in environments so comfortable that they grew up strong, confident, and healthy. But most importantly, the Longhouse had given Vikings something that no other northern people possessed: the psychological advantage of never having truly experienced winter's defeat. While Saxons and Franks knew winter as a season of suffering and limitation, Vikings knew winter as just another time of year when important work got done. This psychological edge may have been their greatest weapon. When you've never really been cold, when you've never experienced the desperation of rationing firewood or the fear of freezing to death, when winter has always been a time of productivity and community rather than survival. Well, you approach the world very differently. The Longhouse had created a people who believed they could master any environment, overcome any challenge, succeed where others failed. And they were about to prove it by exploding across the medieval world like a perfectly managed fire. But even as they prepared for their greatest conquests, the seeds of thermal disaster were already being planted. Changes were coming that would destroy in generations what had taken centuries to perfect, and the price of that loss would be paid not just by Vikings, but by all of human civilization. The year was 1012 after Christ, and everything was about to go wrong. Picture this. King Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, standing in the ruins of what had been the most thermally efficient building in medieval Europe. Not ruins from war or fire, ruins from abandonment. The greatest longhouse in Norway, a marvel that had housed 300 people in perfect comfort for over 2 centuries, was being torn down, stone by stone, timber by timber. Why? Because it was pagan, and pagan things had to go. The Christian conversion of Scandinavia wasn't just a religious revolution, it was a thermal catastrophe. The new faith demanded new architecture, stone churches instead of efficient longhouses, individual family dwellings instead of community halls, vertical prayer spaces instead of horizontal living spaces designed for maximum heat retention. The tragedy is almost too perfect to believe. The very people who had perfected the art of staying warm were systematically destroying their own innovations in the name of spiritual salvation. Within 3 generations, thermal knowledge that had taken 8 centuries to develop was being abandoned faster than a sinking longship. Meet Astrid, the last keeper granddaughter of the legendary Astrid, whose innovations we heard about earlier. As Christianity swept through Scandinavia, she watched her people voluntarily choose to freeze rather than live in pagan buildings. The oral traditions that had preserved thermal secrets were being replaced by written Christian texts that mentioned nothing about heat circulation or smoke management. Astrid tried desperately to preserve the knowledge. She trained her daughters in the old ways, but they were more interested in Christian prayers than pagan heating systems. She offered to teach neighboring clans, but they were busy building stone churches that devoured forests for fuel while leaving worshippers shivering through services. When Astrid died in 1047, the last person who truly understood comprehensive longhouse thermal engineering died with her. The secrets didn't vanish immediately. Fragments survived here and there, but the complete system, the integrated knowledge that had made Viking thermal dominance possible, was gone. The results were immediate and devastating. By 1100, Scandinavian settlements were burning 3 times as much fuel as their ancestors had used while achieving far less comfort. Children who would have grown up strong and healthy in the old longhouses now suffered through winters that stunted their growth and weakened their resistance to disease. Medieval builders tried desperately to recreate what had been lost. Norwegian kings hired Saxon and Frankish architects, hoping foreign expertise could replace native wisdom. These builders produced massive stone halls with dozens of fireplaces, but they never achieved even half the efficiency of the simplest traditional longhouse. The problem wasn't just technical, it was cultural. The longhouse thermal systems had depended on community cooperation, shared knowledge, and oral traditions passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The new Christian architecture reflected individual family structures and written rather than oral knowledge preservation. You couldn't just copy the building techniques, you needed the entire social system that supported them. For 800 years, this thermal wisdom lay buried. Literally buried, in many cases, as abandoned longhouse sites were covered by new construction or simply forgotten. European heating technology actually regressed during the medieval period. The Romans had achieved better heating efficiency in the 1st century after Christ than most European buildings managed in the 15th century. But here's where the story takes a remarkable turn. Fast forward to 1998. Dr. Magnus Eriksson, an archaeologist from the University of Copenhagen, is excavating what local farmers thought was just another medieval foundation. His team uncovers something extraordinary: a perfectly preserved longhouse foundation with its entire thermal system intact. Not just the basic structure, the complete heating, infrastructure. Underground stone channels still in perfect condition. Clay-lined air circulation systems with adjustable vents still operational after 1,000 years. Evidence of the sophisticated animal heating integration that had made Viking halls so efficient. Dr. Ericsson's discovery was like finding a thermal engineering textbook written in stone and clay. For the first time since the medieval period, modern engineers could study a complete Viking heating system and understand exactly how it worked. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The late 20th century was finally ready to appreciate what had been lost. Environmental concerns were driving interest in energy-efficient building techniques. Rising fuel costs were making heating efficiency a practical necessity, rather than just an academic curiosity. Computer modeling could analyze and optimize thermal systems in ways that medieval builders never could have imagined. Most importantly, modern materials science could improve on Viking techniques without abandoning their fundamental principles. You could achieve the thermal mass effects of turf walls using modern insulation. You could create the air circulation benefits of livestock integration using mechanical ventilation systems. You could capture the heat retention advantages of stone channels using radiant floor heating. The revival began in Denmark. The Danish National Museum commissioned a full-scale reconstruction of Dr. Ericsson's longhouse using traditional techniques but modern materials where appropriate. The results were staggering. The reconstructed building used 70% less fuel than conventional buildings of similar size while maintaining superior comfort levels. 70%. In an era of climate change and energy crisis, those numbers got attention fast. Tech companies were among the first to adopt neo-Viking architecture. Northern Dynamics, a software company in Copenhagen, built their headquarters using thermal principles derived from 1,000-year-old longhouse designs. Underground thermal channels, integrated animal heating well, actually integrated server room heating, which produces warm air just like livestock breathing. Thermal mass walls that store and release heat automatically. The results? $2 million in annual heating cost savings, perfect comfort year-round, and a building that actually improves the local environment by requiring so little energy that it produces net positive environmental impact. From Copenhagen, the revival spread to Seattle, where tech companies facing massive heating bills began experimenting with Viking-inspired architecture. To Reykjavik, where geothermal energy was integrated with traditional thermal mass techniques. To Toronto, where entire neighborhoods began adopting communal heating systems based on longhouse designs. But perhaps the most remarkable adoption happened in northern Alaska, where Inuit communities began combining traditional icehouse techniques with reconstructed Viking thermal engineering. The cultural exchange is perfect. Arctic peoples who had developed their own survival heating techniques, learning from other Arctic peoples who had solved the same problems differently. Today, as climate change threatens global stability and energy costs soar beyond what many people can afford, the longhouse is rising again. Architectural schools teach courses in Viking thermal engineering. Environmental engineers study 1,000-year-old ruins to solve 21st-century problems. The ancient wisdom that was abandoned for religious reasons is being embraced again for environmental reasons. The irony is almost too perfect. The same thermal innovations that enabled Viking raids across medieval Europe may now help save modern Europe from climate disaster. The heating systems that supported the Great Viking expansion are being adapted to support sustainable contraction of energy consumption. The Vikings' LOC, greatest raid, may have been on the future itself. They stole thermal technologies from the present and buried them in time, leaving them perfectly preserved for us to rediscover exactly when we need them most. But this isn't just about buildings and heating bills. The Longhouse revival is bringing back something even more valuable. The social technologies that made thermal cooperation possible. Modern eco-villages based on Longhouse principles are rediscovering the community bonds, democratic decision-making, and intergenerational knowledge transfer that were essential to making the original systems work. We're not just rebuilding Viking heating systems, we're rebuilding Viking social systems. And just in time, because the climate challenges ahead will require exactly the kind of community cooperation and thermal innovation that made Viking civilization possible in the first place. The great thermal experiment that began with Ulf's family huddling around their dying fire 800 years before Christ has come full circle. The descendants of those desperate survivors are now the ancestors of our salvation. The thermal secrets that enabled Vikings to thrive in impossible conditions are about to help all of us thrive in what may be equally impossible times. The Longhouse burned bright once before, illuminating the dark ages with the warm glow of human ingenuity. It's burning bright again, and this time, it might just light the way to a sustainable future. Fire was life and death to those ancient families in the frozen darkness. Fire is still life and death to us. The difference is that now we know how to trap its soul and make it last forever.